Does this scenario sound familiar? You've got your ETFs lined up, you're feeling good, everything seems to be going smooth, you're on the easy road of passive investing. But what if I told you, chances are you're actually more of an active investor than you realize? Yes, you heard that right. Most passive investors aren't nearly as passive as they think they are. And today I'm going to show you why your carefully curated portfolio of passive ETFs, quote unquote, passive ETFs, might be disguising a lot more activity than you may have imagined. So without further ado, let's get started. All right, hi there, my name is René Salman, and let's kick things off by discussing the broad distinction between active investing and passive investing. So broadly speaking, the traditional definition of passive investing is that you invest in an index or an ETF that is tracking this index. And then on the other hand, there's active investing. So either you yourself pick individually selected stocks, or you are investing in an active fund or an active ETF. So you are betting on a fund manager delivering alpha. So what this means is a better return than the broader index for you. But the point that I want to make in this video is that the line between active and passive investing may be much more blurred than you may realize. Because I would argue that there are actually a lot of active elements to the discipline of passive investing. So it all starts with the selection of the ETF or the multiple ETFs that you are investing in. Few people realize that that selection itself is a very active choice. You invest in indices that track US stocks, for example, then you are placing a massive bet on the US as an economy doing well going forward. Do you place a bet on maybe a European index or an emerging market index or an index that is focusing on a specific industry? Those are very active choices that are going to have quite an impact on your investment results over the long term. And sometimes I feel like this is an aspect not a lot of people talk about in the realm of quote unquote passive investing. Then of course, under the hood of indices, even if you invest in a broad market indices, there's a lot of rebalancing going on every once in a while. And that is an active element of ETFs as well. However, I find this much less problematic. And what I should also add is that your allocation to different ETFs is also a very active decision you make. Do you contribute 70% of your income to an developed market ETFs and 30% to an emerging market ETF as the classical literature would tell you to do? Well, that is a very active choice. Do you flip the numbers around? That's a very, very active choice. And again, this is going to have a tremendous impact on your long-term returns. Then another active element that I can think of is the problem of market timing. Many so-called passive investors, they are unable to sit still when everything is going down, and maybe we're going through some kind of turbulence in the world of stocks. Maybe they start selling stocks and they gotta live with the results that this behavior creates. And then maybe finally, and this is actually the point that I try to get across in this video, a lot of so-called passive products are actually quite active. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of this in just a second. And this itself is, again, not problematic at all, but I feel like most quote unquote passive investors don't realize this element to the products they invest in. And that's because I believe your average passive investor doesn't know and understand and wants to know a whole lot about the products he or she is investing in. All your average passive investor wants is some kind of product, some kind of asset class that is going to protect his or her purchasing power over time. Ideally, it is able to grow at a rate that is exceeding the inflation rate, so it's increasing the person's purchasing power. And if the product can accomplish that, many people are already quite pleased with that. I can just speak of my wife, for example. She doesn't understand a whole lot about passive investing. Sure, she's heard about the MSCI World, and for instance, she's investing regularly in the MSCI World. But if I were to ask her, well, what components or what companies actually represent a majority or significant parts of that index, she wouldn't be able to tell me. She wouldn't be able to tell me what kind of geographic exposure this index has, what kind of industry exposure, and so on and so forth. And I think that's true for a lot of passive investors. I would assume the average person that follows me on my journey, that watches my channel, is of course much more educated. But feel free to share in the comments down below what your experience is like with regard to the people in your social circle that are investing passively. How much do they really know about the products they are investing in? And so the point I'm trying to make here is that a lot of ETFs are much more active than people realize. And this goes hand in hand with the message I tried to convey in one of my last videos, in which I discussed that the whole universe of ETFs is changing, is much more diverse nowadays than it was a couple of years ago. Broadly speaking, I would distinguish between 3 different types of ETFs. We have purely passively managed ETFs, which is what most people associate with passive index or ETF investing. But then you also have thematic ETFs, and you also have actively managed ETFs, so-called active ETFs. So let us now look at examples of these 3 different types of ETFs, and let me show you how these products may not be as passive as you may think, and that they actually are quite concentrated in a few select number of stocks, which again is an active portfolio construction choice, at least for active ETFs and thematic ETFs. So I will actually start with a broad market index, a broad market ETF, and this is the Invesco Nasdaq 100 ETF. If we just scroll down to the components, the constituents of this index, we can see that Microsoft represents around 8.5% of that index, followed by Apple with a pretty similar weight, followed by Nvidia with a weight of close to 8%, and then you've got Amazon with a weight of 5%. And if you now add up these numbers, so that's 16, 17, let me do the math here, 25, 30, if I'm not mistaken, the top, 4 stocks of this index represent 30% of that index. That's a massive level of concentration. And if you invest in this index or an ETF that tracks this index, you have to realize that you are quite concentrated in these 3 names. And you have to be comfortable with the valuation of these 3 stocks and what this valuation implies for the future returns of the whole index. And I think very few people realize this. Again, if you were to ask someone who has exposure to the Nasdaq 100 index, I think your average investor in that product won't be able to tell you what the top 3 positions in this index are, let alone what the weight of each position is, which again is the point of this video. Many people believe they are investing much more passively than they actually are. 30% in the top 4 names, that's a level of concentration you don't see in a whole lot of individual portfolios that you would look at. Which brings me to the next product. Let's take a look at a thematic ETF. And the thematic ETF that I actually picked here is the MSCI World Semiconductors and Semiconductor Equipment Index. And this is an index we actually looked at in one of my mentoring program Zoom sessions. And this is actually also what made me create this video today, because I was surprised by the numbers that we can find if we look below the hood of this index. So again, let's take a look at the fact sheet and scroll down to the constituents of this index. And to my surprise, I noticed that the largest position in this index, Nvidia, actually has a weight of 48%. This is an insane level of concentration. And again, I believe there are investors out there who are maybe regularly contributing to this product, thinking they are investing passively. But if half of your contributions go into one individual stock, that's not my definition of passive investing. No, my definition of passive investing is that you do invest in a broad selection, a broad basket of different stocks that carry sort of the same weight within the index. Just to illustrate what kind of concentration this actually is, let's compare this level of concentration to the current equity portfolio of Warren Buffett. As most of you will know, he actually trimmed his largest position, Apple, quite recently. So of course, his largest position will be smaller now than it was just last quarter. But if we now just take a look at the portfolio, so we'll head to dataroma.com. We'll look for the portfolio of Berkshire Hathaway. And as you can see, the largest position in Warren Buffett's equity portfolio is still Apple with a weight of 30%, which is almost half of the level of concentration in the top 1 position of the thematic ETF we just looked at. And finally, let's cover an active ETF. Obviously, most people who invest passively will realize that if they pick an active ETF, this is no longer passive investing. But nonetheless, I'm sure there are people out there who think ETF investing is synonymous with passive investing, which clearly it isn't. But again, the ETF I picked, and of course, there is a lot of selection bias here. Feel free to share other ETFs in the comments down below and share maybe the concentration in the top 5 names. But anyway, so the ETF I chose is called Natixis Lumis Sales Focused Growth ETF. That's a hard name to pronounce, isn't it? And again, if we look at the top constituents of this ETF, we can see that the top 10 positions combined actually make up 70% of this ETF. So why do I tell you all of this? Well, I think the way people perceive passive investing obviously has an impact on how people perceive risk. And there may be a lot more risk associated with the products they are investing in than they realize. So I want to raise awareness for this. There are nowadays so many different types of quote unquote passive products out there. I think in my last video I mentioned that in the US alone, there are around 3,300 different ETFs to choose from. Many of these ETFs are not as active as you may think they are. They are much more active in terms of the composition of the portfolio. And then on top of that, you as the person choosing different ETFs are adding another layer of active choices on top of that. Again, there are actually other points I could address here, but I want to keep this video fairly short. Like another topic or aspect to address would, for example, be how do you treat dividends if you are investing in a distributing ETF? Again, those would be active choices. Do you reinvest them back into the index or do you invest them in another kind of product? But again, this would probably deserve its own video. And so with that, I'll wrap it up here. Take care.